Hello, welcome back to Seminary Sunday Online. I'm Brennan walking you through the stories of Elijah and Elisha in the books of Kings. This is a really interesting story we have today. In fact, a strange one, an unusual one, a kind of haunting one that has a kind of a twist ending. This is a story in the Bible that's a bit more like a horror story than many I've read. But also it's one that shows a very strange side of Elisha. It has a lot of similarities to 1 Kings 22 with the story of Jehoshaphat, same king of Judah, that's involved in this story. But Micaiah the prophet is the one he's the prophet that's involved in that story, and has a decidedly different take than Elisha does in this story. So there's a lot of similarities there between 1 Kings 22 and 2 Kings 3. But one really big difference, that is that Elisha kind of helps, it seems, at least in part, helps the military alliance of Judah and Israel and Edom trying to attack Moab. We'll get into some of the details in a minute, but this is a really strange one. It's also a strange story for two other reasons. One reason is that there's a historical artifact called the Mesha Stela, and it's in France today. It's in Paris. It's at the Louvre. You can go see it if someday, hopefully. But it's this giant rock artifact. It's a smooth carved stone, and it's got the story of King Mesha of Moab. It's one of the most amazing artifacts in the world. It's the only preserved bit of Moabite text that we have. And it's a story that sounds an awful lot like parts of the books of Kings in its style. It's written, and from that we learn that Moabite is basically the same as Hebrew. There's a couple of little differences in terms of how the verbs are written, but basically it's the same language. But also it talks about several characters that we also know from the Bible. It talks about King Ahab, talks about Omri, and it talks about some Israelite cities and so on. And what King Mesha describes is kind of like what's described in 2 Kings 3 with some important differences. All to say, it's a strange kind of alignment of having ancient artifacts that back up our stories, at least in some way, but that provide very different perspective, the perspective of the Moabites on what happened. Even if there are some historical discrepancies between the Moabite stela and between the Bible. But there's another thing too, is that this is a story where the ending of the story is so unsettling, in part because it seems to suggest that, first of all, that human sacrifice works. It's like an effective thing. But second of all, that it seems to suggest that another god, the god of the Moabites, seemed to act decisively to defeat Israel. So there's a bunch of things. I mean, I'm not going to solve this riddle for us today. It will remain a riddle after I'm done with it. But just to say, this is a really strange, unusual story that we have. A more typical story about the relationship between Elijah or Elisha and Israel in terms of its war can be found in 2 Kings 6, which we'll get to in a couple weeks. That one's got a really simple message that I think we can all get behind, and you're going to enjoy that one, 2 Kings 6. This one is a little bit stranger. So let's jump in. So we left off last time with the kind of bizarre antics of Elisha, who is acting like a person who both brings life and death, a bit like Yahweh in the Bible, a bit like God, but who has some pretty intense power. So we move from that to this story here. We can see in the 18th of 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 1, in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, Jehoram, the son of Ahab, became king over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 12 years. This is going to be the end of Omri's line. So Omri and Ahab and now Jehoram. And then we're going to have Jehu's rebellion next. So Jehu is going to be, he's a general, he's going to take over, he's going to assassinate the king of the north. So in any event, here we have this final king in Omri's important line in the northern kingdom, who's allied to the king of Judah. Remember, Judah and Israel are two different nations. And verse 2. We have the judgment. This is the person who's responsible for compiling all of what's in the books of Samuel and Kings, especially in the book of Kings, tends to give these judgments, summary judgments about these kings. And these judgments are not about whether or not the king was powerful, or whether or not the king had a good economy, or whether or not the king was a kind of a good person and nice to people or something, or it has nothing to do with any of that. It's just, did they worship God in the way that the book of Deuteronomy tells you to worship God? That's how they're evaluated. So here we have that typical evaluation of Jehoram here. He, that is Jehoram, was evil in the sight of the Lord, though not like his father and mother, for he put away the pillar of Baal that his father had made. So Ahab made a pillar for Baal, and Jehoram thought better of it and put it away. It's proposed that Omri, the first king of this line, Omri is not actually an Israelite name, not a Hebrew name. Omri probably was a foreigner who became the king. He was a general in the army of the northern kingdom and became king after a series of assassinations in the north. You can read about that in 1 Kings 14 and 15 and so on, with Baasha, and there's some Zimri. There's some pretty interesting stories there. But what's important is that this is a pretty common thing to happen in the ancient world. Foreigners often worked their way up through the military and sometimes were able to seize power. In Babylon, there was a dynasty called the Kassite dynasty. They were not Babylonians. They were foreigners who took over. We know about several different dynasties in Egypt that took over. There were pharaohs who were not kind of what we might think of as typical Egyptians, but came from other places, some from Sudan, some for the Hyksos rulers. There were people who came from Canaan, it seems, or from some other Semitic location and took over and ruled for some time. So there are other dynasties, but also like Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was a Hittite guy. He was not a Judahite. He wasn't a Hebrew-speaking person initially, but joined David's army and worked his way up through the ranks, and David eventually got him killed, right? But all to say, these people sometimes could seize power, and so Omri seems to have been one of those people, which is probably why Omri is not so interested in worshiping Yahweh. He didn't grow up like that, right? I mean, that's he comes from a different people, so he probably worshiped Yahweh. He probably didn't have a problem with that, but he also brought the idea that you're supposed to worship lots of gods because everyone outside of Israel does that, right? So in any event, now we got the third generation of rulers who have been steeped in Israel, right? So now the third generation, Jehoram is fully Israelite now, and he's got a name, Jehoram, which is a Yahwist name, the Jah in the front. Yahweh will be exalted, basically, is what his name means. So now we got a Yahweh name, and then also he's acting a bit more like a Yahwist, right? So he put away the pillar of Baal. He became a Yahweh worshiper. But nevertheless, verse 3, he clung to the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin, and he did not depart from it. What that means is that in 1 Kings 12, Jeroboam secedes from the southern kingdom of Judah and makes his own nation, the northern kingdom of Israel, and makes new worship sites in Dan and in Bethel. One in the far north Dan and one in the far south Bethel. Bethel's right close to Jerusalem. And the purpose of that was to make it easy for people to have pilgrimage rituals and worship together, but also to not go all the way to Jerusalem, because then they might become ensnared again by the king of Judah, who says, you're already coming here for pilgrimage festival, right? You might as well just go ahead and be my vassal, right? So all to say that this northern king, is still being judged. The book of Kings is definitely written from the perspective of someone for whom Jerusalem is the main city. That's where the real temple is. So Jehoram, you can think of as being like he loves Yahweh, like he's an ardent Yahwist, but he worships at the wrong place, according to the Deuteronomistic historian, who's telling us that they should worship in Jerusalem. So that's all the evaluation. We don't hear about how strong he is, how powerful he is, etc. That's all that they care about in the Bible is did you worship correctly or not. So then verse 4. Now Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep breeder. Now this is about King Mesha. In 2 Kings 1, we heard this one sentence about the king of Moab, but then they kind of went off on a random tangent, and we lost this thread of the king of Moab for 2 whole chapters when we read about the chariot and everything. And then had a little introduction to Elisha, and now we're back to this story of Moab, which seems to have been kind of underlying those 3 chapters, even if it wasn't really mentioned. So in any event, we're kind of coming back to that narrative thread that was dropped in chapter 1. Mesha was an important king. As I said, he's got this rock, this Mesha Stela. You can just Google that name, Mesha, and you'll see pictures of this rock. You can read a whole translation of it. I'll read you a little bit of it in a moment. But it says he was a sheep breeder. So the Moabites were, for much of their history, nomadic, or at least mostly nomadic. They were sheep breeders, and they began to build like actual settlements around the time of King Mesha, so in the Middle Iron Age. Dibon is a city, a Moabite city, but those seem to be relatively new in the Iron Age, whereas people in Canaan had been settled for thousands of years in cities. So this is think of it like a much weaker people than Israel, a people who are newly settled. Right, they were nomadic people before that, but they are starting to produce a lot of things. But they've also been subjugated to Israel. This may have started around the time of David. David has connections to Moab. He like kind of stashed his parents in Moab, according to the book of Samuel, when Saul was trying to kill David. So David hid his parents there with the king of Moab. This may have been because David had Moabite ancestry. We hear about this in Ruth, right? That Ruth's great-grandmother or great-great-grandmother is Ruth, a Moabitess, a woman from Moab. So in any event, there might have been some deep connections there, but Israel ends up subjugating Moab, making them a vassal. That is, making them pay tribute, just for the bare fact that they're alive. So Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep breeder. He had to deliver the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. That's a lot of stuff. So he's giving over a huge percentage of their yearly output as kind of ransom, right, to Israel. So this isn't necessarily a very ethical relationship that we have here, right? But this is how power politics work in the ancient world. But when Ahab died, the king of Moab, verse 5 says, rebelled against the king of Israel, rebelling by just not paying. He just stopped paying his taxes. That's basically what rebelling means against a major power. Like when the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem, it was because Jerusalem stopped paying their money. Think about ancient empires more as protection rackets than as actual empires. Like, so the Babylonians didn't have a lot of say in, like, the land policy, agricultural policy in Judah or something like that. They didn't have the time or interest to like dictate what was going to happen in particular plots of land in Judah when they took it over. They just told they would bring an army there and say, pay us lots of money or we'll destroy you. And so they paid lots of money for a long time. And when they stopped paying money, then the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem. So that's what kind of what's happening here. Moab rebelled. The king of Moab, Mesha, just stops paying. So King Jehoram marched out of Samaria at that time and mustered all of Israel. This is what kings do. If you have an empire in the ancient world, it's not really an empire. By the time of the Greeks, the Romans, you start to have more actual empire kind of situations. The Persians might be the first ones to actually build a fairly, I don't know. They built roads between the different parts of their empire. They actually had some Persian people come every once in a while to check on what you were doing. They did get involved sometimes in the local politics of places that they had conquered. But most of what it was just a resource transfer. They just wanted stuff. So, in any event, King Jehoram is going to go get his stuff. He marched out of Samaria at that time and mustered all Israel. That means the army, right? So that he gets all the army together. And he went and sent word to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, the king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to battle against Moab? And he said, I will go. I am as you are. My people are your people. My horses are your horses. You might recognize this. This is exactly the same language that we saw in 1 Kings 22. This is in fact the same guy, Jehoshaphat. The purpose of this is covenantal language. This is how you signify a covenant. The way that this is spoken means that Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, is a vassal of the northern king. So Jehoram, the king of the northern kingdom of Samaria, right? He is the lord, and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, is a vassal. Judah is smaller than the northern kingdom. It's less wealthy. It's less powerful. It gets less rain, less agricultural crops. There's less people, less population density. Of course, it's subservient to the northern kingdom, at least until the northern kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians. But we'll get to that at some day later. But for now, so Jehoshaphat is signaling that he is a vassal, and here's his covenantal formula. I am as you are, my people are your people, my horses are your horses. This might remind you of Ruth, by the way, right? Ruth chapter 1, where she uses covenantal language to make a relationship with Naomi. Then he said, that is the king, says, well, which way shall we march? And Jehoram said, by the way of the wilderness of Edom. So they want to go to Moab. If you just kind of Google Moab on a map, you'll see that Moab is on the eastern side of the Jordan River and of the Dead Sea. Israel and Judah were both on at least centrally on the western side of the Jordan River. Israel's territory sometimes extended to the eastern side of the Jordan River, but usually north of Moab. So Moab is basically straight east of Jerusalem across the Dead Sea, and then Edom is further south than that. So basically they're taking this big circuitous route all the way down. Actually, I got to move my hand like this. All the way down the Dead Sea, rounding the Dead Sea, and then coming up through Edom all the way to Moab to have basically a surprise attack. If they just kind of go straight across the Jordan, Moab will see them and occupy high ground and get ready for them and so on. So they're going to go through this. Well, this is a tough thing though. This wilderness march through either the desert of Edom, because you could die, and they almost do. So, because it's a big desert area, very little water, and it's perilous. This is also why it would be a good surprise attack, because you wouldn't expect an army to go that way. So the king of Israel went with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. So because they're going through Edom's territory, they have to talk to Edom, but also Edom seems to have been a vassal, at least much of the time, to Judah. Edom seems to have hated this, that being a vassal to Judah, but they had to cooperate with them at times, or Judah would destroy them, or Israel would destroy them. We see this later on, that Edom takes out its aggressions when Babylon destroys Jerusalem. There at least is a tradition in ancient Judah that on that day, the Edomites joined in with the destruction of Jerusalem. They worked with the Babylonians. There's a little bit of a dispute about that historically, but that was at least a big part of the memory of what happened to the destruction of Jerusalem, was that the Edomites joined in the fray and became enemies after that. Remember, the Edomites were, this is Esau's people, so they're like relatives. And by the way, Edomites seem to have worshipped the god Yahweh. They called this god Kos, the bow, but there's a few people named Kosayahu in the Bible. The bow is Yahweh, Kosh, and this seems to be associated with the idea that Yahweh put down the bow in the rainbow, right, in Genesis 9. So all to say that the Edomites don't have a god besides Kos, and Kos is a kind of strange name for a god. Bo is a strange name for a god, and it doesn't show up in any other pantheon or anything like that. So most historians who've looked closely into this do think that the Edomites were Yahweh worshippers. But after there was this animosity between Judah and Israel and Edom, Edom started to treat their god quite differently. So the bow they stopped talking about Yahweh, and they started just calling their god the bow, because they just hated Israel so much. So all to say that this is some of the consequences of war. It put a wedge between two peoples who previously had been not only on friendly terms, but had been cousins, genealogically and religiously. So in any event, this story seems to start off almost celebrating war, and Elisha seems to be part of this battle and so on, but it still is so strange. Elisha plays such a strange role in this, and then the ending of the story is so unusual and unsettling that it ends up, what seems to be kind of celebrating war turns on a dime, and it almost tries to get you excited about watching a battle happen and like rooting for Israel, and then that rooting turns to some kind of horror. In any event, so the king of Israel went with the king of Judah and the king of Edom, and after they made a circuitous march of 7 days, there was no water for the army or the animals that followed them. Like I said, it was a risky venture, and they didn't happen to pass much water, and they were about to die. And then the king of Israel said, "Alas," and that word "hoi," it's like woe. Like we're about to die. The Lord has called these 3 kings to give them into the hand of Moab. This is like giving up, right? God called us so that we should die. Like this is, God trapped us. So an interesting, sort of theological comment, right? God is behind this in order to kill us because God doesn't like us for some reason. And Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, said, maybe not, right? He doesn't say no, but that's what he says next indicates that he probably said, I don't know about your reading of that, Jehoram. I don't know if God called us here to die. Let's see. He said, is there no prophet of the Lord here, through whom we may inquire of the Lord? Let's get a prophet up here and check out what God has to actually say. Again, prophets are people who can hear messages from God. So then one of the king of Israel's servants answered, Elisha, the son of Shaphat, is here, who poured water on the hands of Elijah. That is, he served him, right? I mean, he was cleaning Elijah. Elisha was cleaning Elijah, cleaning his stuff in his hands and so on. And Jehoshaphat said, the word of the Lord is with him. So in other words, Jehoshaphat says, oh yeah, I know that guy. I know that he does know Yahweh pretty well. What's weird is that why is Elisha with them? He's not a part of Israel's war machine. He, in fact, is clearly against it many times, like in 2 Kings 6. Not against it to the sense that he's for Israel's enemies, but just that he has a reputation for undermining the army of Israel. And this is kind of true of Elijah too. So as we see, Elisha has this really strange relationship to Israel's power and Israel's military. Again, not a purely negative relationship, but one that is very complex. So the fact that he would be on this long march, but also that they wouldn't he's not front and center. He's just kind of walking with them. He's out there with them, right? Sorry. So Jehoshaphat says, yeah, I know that guy. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. So they actually get off their horses and they're trying to find this guy in the ranks somewhere. He's just kind of walking. So Elisha said to the king of Israel, then, what have I to do with you? I love this because Elisha is part of this military journey. And the only people that are on this journey are people who need to be there. Who's going to go on a 7-day march around the desert of Edom? Unless you have to, first of all. But second of all, with the army, if you're with the army, you're with the army, right? I mean, who's just kind of taking a joyride, marching on a military hike, to a dangerous place in the middle of nowhere. But Elisha's response seems to say, why are you talking to me? I don't have anything to do with you. He's part of the army. Imagine a private saying that to a general or something. What do I got to do with you, bud? Hey, why are you talking to me? So then he says, go to the prophets of your father and to the prophets of your mother. Now he's talking about Baal, right? I mean, he's kind of like a soft spot almost, like Jehoram, remember, he's put away the prophets of Baal. He's put away the pillar of Baal. He's a good Yahwist. But what Elisha seems to be saying here is that you moved away from your parents a little bit, but not in some core things, right? Remember, Omri was a general who assassinated the king and then fought a bloody civil war and then took over power and then built his own fortress to consolidate his power after that. He was a pretty intense guy. And then Ahab is famous for having fought and won several battles. He fought at the Battle of Karkar, which is a massive battle that actually we have external records of with the Assyrian Empire, and seems to have brought a massive army and won a major victory. So this is these aren't silly people. These kings, they are intense people, and Jehoram seems to have learned from them, right? So Jehoram might be worshiping Yahweh, but Elisha seems to be saying, you haven't changed. You're the same person that they were. You may be saying you're worshiping a different God, but you're worshiping the same stuff they are. Go to the prophets of your mother and father. In other words, I got nothing for you. But what's crazy, again, he's marching with this army in the middle of nowhere. He's been there the whole time. What else are you doing here, bud? But then the king of Israel said, no, it is Yahweh who has called these 3 kings to give them into the hand of Moab. So again, the king of Israel is going back to his answer. I'm not going to go to the other prophets. I know what's happened here. God is judging us and wants us to die. That's when Elisha said, as the Lord of hosts lives. Now remember, host means armies, right? As Yahweh of the armies lives. Remember, this is an oath. So Elisha's swearing an oath formula. His general came up to him, his commander-in-chief came up to him, and he said, I don't have anything to do with you. But then he's like, I'll swear by Yahweh. So again, this is about allegiances and loyalty and so on. Before whom I stand, as in, I don't stand before you, king, even though I'm marching in your army. As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, were it not that I have regard for Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, I would neither look at you nor see you. So he thinks very little of Jehoram, the king of Israel. But the only reason he's there is because Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, is kind of a good guy, so he'll follow him around. So this is partly why he's responding this way. But then he says, but now bring me a musician. Now, music was understood to kind of be able to send people into what's called a frenzy. This doesn't mean like a Viking frenzy where they're going to kill people. A frenzy it's a prophetic state. And this is, by the way, another word for this in psychological terms that are more familiar to us today is the fugue state. So when you when people drive home and they all of a sudden realize that they've driven home and they don't know, what happened. You ever do that? You ever go for a walk and then you kind of finish your walk and you're like, I don't remember my walk very well, but I got where I was supposed to be. It's not that I was asleep, I was awake, but gosh, I don't really I was like deep in thought or something, right? That's a fugue state. Sometimes people can get caught in those for some time and forget or like not pay attention to what's around them. Sometimes you can train yourself. Some certain people are susceptible to these. And it's possible to train ourselves to be attentive to that state and to nurture it. Music can help people get into it. I mean, think about the poet Rumi, the Islamic poet, who has beautiful poetry, and other Sufi mystics, S-U-F-I. If you haven't read the poetry of Rumi or Hafiz or other Sufi poets, I really recommend it. It's beautiful stuff. But they would speak their poetry after spinning for a long time to music. They would get into the music and they would spin and spin and spin and spin. Whirling dervish is another term that's used to describe this kind of this activity and the people who perform it. But they would get themselves into an altered state of consciousness, and then they would perform poetry. So this is called a frenzy state. So Elisha says, he's like, think of the whirling dervish, right? I want some music. I'm going to spin around to it. And I'm going to put myself in a frenzy state. We see this also in 1 Samuel 10. Saul does this with some prophets. And the musician played, and the hand of the Lord came upon him. Hand meaning the power. So God's power came upon him. So he this is his way of getting in touch with God in the middle of the wilderness here. Think of Elisha kind of going on a spirit quest, like he's gonna get on a substance and go up on top of a mountain and wait and sweat for 3 days, and then he's gonna see God. I mean, that's kind of what this is, but just using music out in the middle of the wilderness. But then he said, verse 16, "Thus says the Lord, I will make this dry stream bed full of pools." This is a prophetic way of speaking. Prophets often spoke in metaphors, not just in Israel, but throughout the ancient world. Much of what we've got from prophets is very metaphorical. Sometimes from other ancient or Eastern cultures, the prophets speaking kind of these proverbs, like these little quick sayings that you have to kind of excavate for meaning. And we actually have some letters from other ancient or Eastern peoples, especially the king of Mari, M-A-R-I, a ancient or Eastern city, where the king was very interested in prophecy and would receive these like short one line kind of proverbs, like there's water underneath straw. And then we have these letters where people are trying to interpret this, like the queen in one case is trying to interpret what this means for the king. But so here we get one of these short kind of suggestive prophecies, right? Thus says the Lord, that's the messenger formula. Elisha is reporting what God had to say, what came to him in the middle of his spinning and musical induced frenzy. I'll make this dry stream bed full of pools. Now they're in the wilderness, right? So water's going to come up. So thus says the Lord, you shall not see wind or rain, but that stream bed shall be filled with water, so that you shall drink, you, your livestock, and animals. Okay, so they're going to have water in the middle of the wilderness, and that's going to be great. And then it says, this is a light thing in the sight of the Lord. Light meaning like it's easy. This is nothing compared for God to do, right? God will also give the Moabites into your hand. Now, remember that into the hand language has happened a couple times, except the king Jehoram of the north has said that we were, the kings of Israel and Judah and Edom were going to be given into the hand of Moab. That's what God wanted. Well, Moab will be, the Moabites will be in your hand, in your power, and you shall attack every fortified city and every choice city, and shall fell every good tree and stop up all the springs of water and ruin every piece of good land with stones. Now this sounds like a positive prophecy to those kings. But there should be a suggestion, like, people who hear this and who know about the traditions that are in the Bible, their ears perk up, because a really important, I mentioned a bit earlier that the Deuteronomistic historian, the person who's collected all these stories in Kings, didn't write all these stories, but they've sometimes interjected some things in here and highlighted some things, and they've organized it in a particular way. And when I say Deuteronomistic, it's somebody who's really deeply informed by the book of Deuteronomy. who has organized this history that starts with Joshua and then goes to Judges and then 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. It doesn't have Ruth in it because Ruth it fits in there like kind of narratively, but Ruth is very clearly written by a different source. It doesn't include a lot of these same issues that we see in the Deuteronomistic history throughout, like judging kings based on whether or not they followed the book of Deuteronomy to a T, which we saw earlier in chapter 3. So one thing that should make our ears perk up if we know Deuteronomy really well is that Deuteronomy chapter 20 gives us some very specific rules for war. And one of those rules for war is don't you dare touch those trees. If you're laying siege to a city, you don't touch their fruit trees. The trees are good. Don't hurt the trees. If you want to take over the territory, you got to use the trees. Or if you're gonna, the people are going to use the trees. People are going to eat fruit from them. Why the heck would you cut these things down? There's not a lot of water in the ancient world. Everyone's short on food. Come on. So there's a couple other rules for warfare like that. There's this very it's sacrosanct. But here we see this kind of total war being reflected in Elisha's prophecy that goes against the book of Deuteronomy, which actually says don't do this total war except for this one time. The book of Joshua narrates this. The conquest of Canaan is the only time that they're supposed to do anything that's like total war. Now, that's its own ethical and theological historical problem. I don't have time to get in the book of Joshua right now, but I have recorded some videos on how I understand the book of Joshua in its ancient Near Eastern context. If you're interested in those, I can send you the links to them. But just for our sake now, this is not one of those conquests. Moab is not in Canaan. The Israelites are not conquering it as part of the coming into the land, out of the wilderness wanderings. This is totally different, and they're not supposed to be destroying all of the food. They're not supposed to be destroying all of the livestock, all the animals. They're not supposed to, if they go to war, there's very specific rules in Deuteronomy. First, they're supposed to ask for peace. They're supposed to tell people, hey, let's try to work this out diplomatically first. They're actually supposed to do that every time. If they absolutely can't work it out that way, then they're supposed to proceed with this kind of limited warfare. So this is really different that Elisha is saying this, and it should make us kind of think, wait, Elisha is telling them that they're supposed to not follow God's law? Right after we heard that Jehoram is being, terribly criticized, right? Because he didn't follow God's law in Deuteronomy. Well, maybe it helps us to just read this again and see which parts Elisha is Elisha telling this is good or not, right? You shall not see wind or rain, but that stream bed shall be filled with water, so that you shall drink, you, your livestock, and your animals. This is a simple thing in the sight of the Lord. God will also give the Moabites into your hand. That is, God is going to give them into your power. Because remember, the king has been saying that the whole time that they have been given into the hand of the Moabites. And Elisha says, no, actually, you have more power than they do, right? You have bigger armies than they do. You're the boss. You have 3 armies and they have 1. They are nomadic people who have recently settled down. Yes, you can dominate them, and God is going to give them into your hand. But does that mean you have to squish them, right? So what Elisha doesn't say is that God has said that you have to attack every fortified city and every choice city. God says you're going to. God has given them into your hand, and what are you going to do? You're going to attack every fortified city, every choice city. You're going to cut down every good tree. You're going to stop up all those springs of water and ruin every good piece of land with stones. I think this is supposed to be a lament. He's telling them what they're going to do, regardless of what he tells them. If he told them, please don't do it, they would say, thanks for the water. So, in other words, Elisha has not given them water yet in these 7 days. Why? Maybe he's, if he gives them water, then they get the energy that they need to go on and destroy these other people and destroy their land. The next morning, about the time of the offering of sacrifice, that is, in the morning, so the sacrifices were offered in the morning and in the evening in the temple. They're understood to be times where God's kind of close to the people. So the next morning, about the time of the offering of the sacrifice, behold, water came from the direction of Edom till the country was filled with water. So all this water emerges out of nowhere. And the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them. So the Moabites have scouts going out, right? And they finally say, oh no, they're coming, and they're coming from this unexpected direction from the south. Oh no, through the desert. So the Moabites are getting ready. They're all, you imagine these people throwing on their armor, and youngest to oldest, everyone's trying to defend themselves. And then they come up to the border, right? They're all like going up there to the border of Edom and waiting to fight. And when they rose early in the morning and the sun shone in the water, the Moabites saw the water opposite them as red as blood. It seems to be because of the sun shining on it that it looks like blood, maybe a red sunrise, a pink sunrise. And they're not used to seeing water in this vast desert. So perhaps, it's this kind of effect. It looks like a blood red river. And so then what do they say? Oh my gosh, this is blood. These kings have surely fought together and struck one another down. So in other words, they're like, yeah, these guys had a civil war amongst themselves in the middle of the desert, and all this blood is everywhere, right? Instead, it was the water that they were using to drink and, refresh themselves and their horses. So then they say, now Moab to the spoil. So they've misinterpreted the situation. They're running to their doom, right, against a much larger army. Instead, they should take a high ground, defend themselves, right? But now they're running down into the battle. They came up to the camp of Israel. The Israelites rose and struck the Moabites till they fled before them. So the Israelites are bigger, they're stronger, and they went forward, striking the Moabites as they went. So the Israelites are defending themselves here, but of course they're on the offense in general. And then they proceed to invade further into Moab, and the Moabite army is fleeing. And they overthrew the cities. And on every good piece of land, every man threw a stone until it was covered. This is, sort of fulfilling that prophecy. But, it was Elisha kind of, if you think that Elisha was, jingoistic, kind of rooting for the armies of Israel, and kind of, in kind of a negative form of patriotism, right? Like rooting for your country to destroy this other country just because they exist, right? If you think Elisha is like that, we'll continue to read stories about Elisha, and he is no friend to the kings of Israel. He's also not exactly an enemy to the kings of Israel. That is to say, he's kind of neutral. He's on another side altogether, God's side. So, in any event, if you think that he's like, triumphantly, saying yes, like, I think Elisha is gnashing his teeth. I don't think he wants this. He just knows this is what's going to happen if he gives them this. Either this army's going to die in the wilderness, or I'm going to give them water, and they're going to go on to kill all these people. What do I do? Who do I save? Who dies? So in any event, until only the stones were left in Kir Hareseth, when the slingers surrounded and attacked it. They're having no mercy. They're blocking up the agricultural lands with stones. It's awful. When the king of Moab saw the battle was going against him, this is a strange part. He took 700 swordsmen to break through opposite the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him for a burnt offering on the wall, child sacrifice, which, there's arguments about this. Child sacrifice is talked about, at least mentioned kind of several times in the Old Testament. We don't have a lot of external evidence about this. There's some perhaps archaeological evidence of different places where ancient Near Easterners offered their children in child sacrifices, but there's arguments about some of those places too, about what there's like one place that has a bunch of bones of children, but this could be a child graveyard, right? The child mortality rates were incredibly high in the ancient world. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the children were sacrificed. So all to say that there is some debate about this, but what the story says is that this king sacrificed his son, and then this is probably the strangest part for any Christian to read this text, or Jew. This is an incredibly strange thing to be in this text. So let me just read verse 27, the last verse of this story. Then he took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him for a burnt offering on the wall. And there came a great wrath against Israel. From where? From who? From God? Who knows? But it doesn't say. Just this wrath came against them, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. Period. What it seems is that the wrath came from the God of Moab. It doesn't say that in the text, but if God was angry at the king of Moab for this, then would God not attack the king of Moab or the Moabites, right? The anger is directed against Israel. Now, so some people have said this is the God of Moab. So I'm going to read you here. I'm going to finish with something else. I think the way the story is being told by the Deuteronomistic historian, I think there's a different lesson. But let me just read you this. This is from the book Hidden Riches by Christopher Hayes. It has a chapter 10. Called The Divine in History, and it's got this Mesha inscription, or the Mesha stela, this inscription. It's about a similar event, if not this event, and it starts out like this. And you can just Google Mesha Stela or Mesha inscription, and you can find other translations online. But this is one. I am Mesha, son of Chemosh. Chemosh is the name of the god of Moab. I am Mesha, son of Chemosh, king of Moab, the Dibonite. Dibon is the city that is the capital of Moab. My father ruled over Moab 30 years, and I ruled after my father. I built this high place for Chemosh. Remember, a high place? It just means a place of worship. It doesn't mean a bad place anywhere except for in the Bible. I built this high place, this sacred place for Chemosh in the citadel, so in Dibon, a high place of victory because he made me more victorious. The God made me more victorious than all the kings, and because God caused me to dominate all my enemies. And then the stela continues. Omri was king of Israel. For many days he subjugated Moab. Remember, Moab was a vassal, and right, they stopped paying their taxes, right? But this is telling us from the perspective of the Moabites. Omri was king of Israel. For many days he subjugated Moab because Chemosh was angry with his land. So Chemosh, the god of Moab, this is what the Moabites are saying. Chemosh, our god, was mad at our land, and so gave us over to a foreign king to dominate us. This is actually pretty much the theology of the book of Kings, which says that Babylon came and destroyed Jerusalem because Jerusalem needed to be rebuilt. It needed to be reformed. It had rebelled against Yahweh. This is to say, this is a theology that's not only held in ancient Israel. Its neighbors had, at least some, had some pretty similar ideas. So why did Israel dominate Moab? According to the Moabites themselves, because our God was mad at us. But then verse 6, and Omri's son, that is Ahab, replaced him, and he too said, I will subjugate Moab. Now this son could mean Ahab. It also could mean Jehoram, because the son of the king could mean anyone in that king's line. So in any event, this might mean Jehoram. If it does mean Ahab, then there's a little bit of a discrepancy here. If it does mean Jehoram, then it fits with 2 Kings 3. So in my days, that is in the days of Mesha, the king of Moab, he said, him meaning whoever this king of Israel was, that he said that, but I dominated him in his house, and Israel was completely destroyed forever. So the king of Moab said that he completely destroyed Israel forever. And he said he killed all these Israelites, and I slew all the people. I slew all of them because I had dedicated. And he actually says that he killed the unborn children, the wombs of Israelites, because I had dedicated it, that is all Israel, to the ban. This is like the total destruction for Ashtar Chemosh, his god. Then I took the vessels of Yahweh and I dragged them before Chemosh. He must have destroyed some small sanctuary and taken some of the vessels that were at the sanctuary and took them and put them in the altar to Chemosh back in Dibon. So in any event, there's more of it there. But just to say that that's Moab's perspective on this, right? That they destroyed all of Israel. So when Joshua says that they destroyed, Israel destroyed all the Canaanites or something, that's not what happened. But also we put stones on every single, in this story, 2 Kings 3, we put stones on every single piece of our agricultural ground. I mean, not really. That's just the way they talk. This is propaganda, royal propaganda from the ancient world. But there's no mention of child sacrifice there in that story. But in any event, what could this mean? This conclusion in verse 27. He took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him for a burnt offering on the wall, like in sight of everyone, right? And then there came a great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. It just ends like that. There's no interpretation here that doesn't really suggest what you should believe. It's possible that it's trying to say that Chemosh, the god of Moab, came out and actually won the victory or something. That child sacrifice is powerful. That it actually does something, but it does something. It's like unleashes an evil power that is powerful, that can repel armies. I don't see that here. Maybe that's like an ancient version of this story. Maybe someone along the line meant that somehow. But the great wrath against Israel, I wonder, in light of the fact that Elisha is not a pro Israel domination prophet. There are prophets who say those kinds of things sometimes, He's not one. He's not a nationalistic prophet. He doesn't really care about Israel as a nation, and he doesn't hate foreigners. He doesn't root for Israel to dominate its neighbors. We'll see this in coming weeks too. But so maybe the wrath that comes against Israel that pushes it away is that these Moabites were in their own homes fighting for their own lives, and Israel pushed them to the point where one of them killed their own son, who was to reign in his place. I think that's there in verse 27 to tell us that the king of Moab is not like he's killing someone he hates. He loves his son. His hope for his future is in this person, and he thinks that, I don't know, mistakenly, that sacrificing his son is going to like win the day or something or whatever. But Israel has put people in such a desperate situation that they're going to do this, that they're going to sacrifice their kids because they think that's what they have to do to survive, for their people to survive. Israel did this to someone. And that wrath that's unnamed, maybe that's God's wrath against them to make them go away. Maybe Elisha wasn't foretelling a great victory, but he was foretelling a great moral collapse. You're going to put stones on their farm, on their farm plots, and you're going to kill all their animals, and you're going to cut down all their trees. You're going to make life there horrific and horrendous and almost impossible for them. And maybe God's wrath was energized by that. I don't know. There are probably other and better readings of this out there, but that's the hard text to grapple with. Next week, we're going to move to some much more upbuilding stories, and we'll stay that way for some time with the stories of Elijah and Elisha. Now we're only in the stories of Elisha. We finished the stories of Elijah, but starting with chapter 4, we'll have some more stories that actually echo the stories of Elijah, but stories about life and death, and stories about once we get more into the stories of Elisha. Maybe chapter 3 will take a little bit more shape in your mind about what you think. If you have other interpretations of it, I'd be happy to hear them at some point. May God be with you this week in whatever way. Hopefully not like this. Peace.